Boom! Welcome back to the 21 Convention 2021 of Orlando, Florida, being held at the 21 Summit 2021 as well, our Super Triple event. Our next speaker is a returning alumni speaker to the 21 Convention, first speaking in 2018 and later in 2019 at our Fatherhood Patriarch event. He's a clinical psychologist out of Denver, Colorado. You probably know him best from his book, The Tactical Guide to Women, and is an amazing man. He's a man who I think, particularly in the manosphere, but even in the wider world today, who really cares about truth and science and the pursuit of truth. So in our anti-scientific age where they tell you to trust the science and all this made-up garbage, this is one of the few men who's an academic and a professional who actually really cares about these issues on a deep intellectual level. So without further ado, please help me welcome back to the 21 Convention stage, Dr. Sean T. Smith. Welcome back, sir.
Okay, Anthony.
Yes, sir.
Morning, gentlemen. There's a street in my hometown of Denver, Colorado. It's called Colfax Avenue, and they say it is the longest continuous commercial street in the United States. I don't know about that, but it's 26 miles long. And my entire adult life, I've had a particular affection and sentimentality for Colfax Avenue. So every year, about this time of year when the weather is beautiful in Colorado, I will gather up some family and some friends on a Sunday, and we will walk 18 miles of Colfax Avenue through all kinds of neighborhoods just to see what we can see. Because you notice things in life when you slow down. For example, here's something that my brother noticed this year. He noticed that when he is walking along the well-manicured bike path along the canal in his nice suburban neighborhood, almost nobody will make eye contact and return a greeting. But when you're walking down Colfax Avenue, doesn't matter where you are, doesn't matter what the person looks like, doesn't matter how down and out they appear to be or how tough they appear to be or how many teeth they have in their head, if they are awake and conscious, there's a very good chance that they will look you in the eye and return a greeting with a smile. That's an interesting disparity to think about. But it's not what I'm here to talk about. I want to tell you about a scene that I saw on Colfax Avenue many years ago. This was a man and a woman having an argument, a very loud argument, but she was the only one doing any talking. This man literally had his back against the wall, and she was in his face, on her toes, finger in his face, yelling at him, on and on. And he was standing there looking like a little boy who was just overcome with shame. He's closed body language, he was trying to evade her eye contact, and he would look over this way, and she would circle around and get right in his face and continue yelling at him, and he'd turn his head back this way, trying to evade their eye contact. She'd circle around, get in his face, scream at him. Now, what can we say about these two individuals? I don't think we can say anything, really, because this is just one data point, and I don't know about you, I try very hard not to take one data point and paint an entire picture about a human being. But what can we say about the relationship? If you think about the relationship as an entity that two people create, it's of them, but it's separate from them, and it's larger from them. And there's something going on in this relationship, and while we can't really judge anything about the individuals, I think it's fair to say that if you were standing there with me and we were watching this unfold, that maybe we can draw some kind of conclusion about the relationship. Because we have a woman who, it's easy to say that she's the aggressor because she's the one that's out of control, and she was the one that's out of control. But if you want to understand an interaction and a relationship, you have to look at more than one point of view. You have to check out more than one vantage point. So from her point of view, maybe it's pretty damned aggravating to be with somebody who helped you create some sort of conflict and then goes catatonic when you're trying to solve it. So who's the aggressor? I don't know. But I think it's reasonable to take a guess that in this relationship between these two people, this might not be the first time they've ever gone down that path, and might not be the last time where she is pursuing him in search of some kind of answer to something, and he is retreating. It's fair to say that maybe this thing that's unfolding in front of us is a part of a larger pattern with them. So if you think about the relationship as a thing on its own, then you can ask yourself the question, what is this relationship bringing into this man's life at that moment? And at that moment, it's probably not bringing anything good. If you were to ask him, in fact, if that blue genie from Aladdin were to come down and ask this man and say, hey, my man, you can have anything you want, one wish, you name it, he would probably say, I wish this woman would just stop talking. We've all been, well, I don't know if we've all been there. A lot of us have been there. And when you start asking, what does the relationship bring into a life? That's really what I want to talk about. When you think about, for the next hour or so, I want to think about relationships as an entity of their own. We're going to set the person aside. We're going to set the woman aside. And I'm going to be talking about it, the relationship. It does not refer to the woman. It refers to the relationship. And this little talk is going to be a talk in 4 parts, 4 chapters, if you will. Chapter 1 is going to be called assessment. I want to talk about one of the things that psychology is really good at. And psychology is really good at taking something that's sort of abstract and pinning it down and measuring the hell out of it. And there's a particular methodology that psychologists use that I think is useful in thinking about the people that we bring into our lives and the relationships that we create with those people. So that's chapter 1. Chapter 2 is called Peter the Great. Peter the Great, if you'll recall, was the Russian Tsar from 1682 to 1725. Don't worry, there's not going to be a quiz. But Peter is an interesting character, fascinating character actually, because he was so dichotomous. On the one hand, he's remembered primarily as being the great reformer for Russia because Peter inherited the throne at a young age, and he looked around and he noticed that Russia was landlocked and it was a little bit isolated and it was a little bit behind the times. And so he saw what was going on in Western Europe in terms of technology and trade and diplomacy, and he wanted some of that for his country. So he went to Western Europe and he brought back so much technology, and he actually took this landlocked nation, gave it a port, created a navy, brought them kicking and screaming into the 1700s. So Peter the Great was a great reformer. Peter the Great was also, in my estimation, a bit of a regressive, because while he was touring Western Europe, he surely encountered some of the Enlightenment ideals that were starting to form at the time. Things like personal sovereignty and rule of law. Those things could not have escaped his attention. And yet he had no interest in bringing that part of advancement back to Russia. He was pretty happy to be the autocrat and the boss. So that's the dichotomous nature of Peter the Great. He was a reformer and he was a regressive, in my estimation. He was also, in his personal life, very dichotomous, because Peter was capable of tremendous violence and cruelty. And you can make the argument that any sovereign of his era, that was just part of the job. And I don't get the sense that Peter relished in that part of the job, torturing people, going to war, killing people, killing dissidents, but he was willing to do it. He was clearly willing to do it. He did it to his own son, which is a very tragic story. I think that story shows both his capacity for connection and his capacity for his heartbreak and cruelty at the same time. But he was perfectly capable of being cruel and violent. At the same time, dichotomous Peter the Great was clearly capable of relationships that were kind and compassionate. He was capable of romantic connection and loyalty. And Peter the Great had an untold number of women in his lives, but he had 3 primary relationships. He was essentially a serial monogamist. And 2 of those relationships were marriages. And those 2 marriages were with women who were ostensibly perfectly reasonable, fine, attractive, intelligent women, but the relationships had very different characters, and they had very different effect on his life and his work. So I want to talk about those 2 relationships, and I think there's something useful that we can gather from Peter the Great's romantic life. It's not profound, but it's useful. Chapter 3, I'm going to call shame. And I'm not going to talk about it in the same sense that people like Robert Glover, who does such a wonderful job of talking about how shame can infect us and how it poisons our relationships. I'm going to leave that part to the professionals. I want to talk about shame in a more of an evolutionary sense. Like, what's it for? Why do we have this thing? And what are the messages that we as men get from society, and how does it affect, if it affects, the way we choose our women and the relationships that we choose? So that's chapter 3. Oh, and in chapter 3, I am going to share with you my favorite gender studies essay. And if you don't have a favorite gender studies essay, you should get one because that shit is hilarious. There's nothing that these people cannot ruin for themselves. This particular essay you may have heard about because it got a lot of press at the time, and it's very instructive. The reason I like this essay so much, even though it is irrational, it is emotionally unhinged, it's very honest about what certain people, influential people out there in the society, are demanding of you and me as men. So that's chapter 3, shame. Chapter 4, I'm going to call the experiment. And the experiment is something that I'm going to suggest to any man who's interested in possibly opening a can of worms. You should take this under advisement that it might cause some problems. But the experiment is simply to take an inventory of the relationships that you're choosing, again, separate from the people, the relationships as an entity that you are bringing into your life, and maybe there's some room for improvement. Because one of the things that I noticed early on in my career was that as I was talking to men about the relationships that they were choosing, almost no man that I spoke to could tell me who sat them down and talked to them about women and the relationships they choose. Nobody told them, hey, you can have standards. You can look for women who are of good character and have shared values and are emotionally mature and who take care of their mental health. You can have some standards in your relationships, in the women that you choose. But even when I wrote the Tactical Guide to Women to try to address that problem, and clearly I keyed in on something that is resonating with people, I knew that looking at the woman that you bring into your life, or the women, is only half the equation. The other half is the relationship. That's why I'm focusing on this today. And the reason I frame this as an experiment, there's actually two reasons. One